Today we have Tessa Rosado, who is a poet and a mother, and she's coming to bring lots of different conversations today, but all really aligning with who is we as women. What are the expectations, the hidden burdens, the ways that we see ourselves in this reality, in the world that we live in? How can we mother differently? How can we find stillness in the world that we live in? How can we find ourselves when everything feels out of control and a little bit distant? How can we come back to our center and remember who we really are and the value that we inherently hold? So hi Tessa, thank you so much for coming today to speak to me.
Hi Amber, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation.
I know we've spoken on the phone and our conversation was just so deep and just so profound, and I wanted to bring this conversation. And for me, it's this whole idea of this concept that we believe in some way that we have to play by the narrative that we are good girls or good women. And I wanted to get your take on how do you believe this narrative has really influenced the expectations placed on women?
That's a big question. I think, the philosopher in me wants to start by defining what we mean by good. And, that embodies a lot. But I think in the culture and the society that we're living in, it means being able to do it all and being able to do it all perfectly without letting anyone or anything down. So the way that I think that is playing out is that we have reached this unusual point in history that we perhaps haven't seen in the same way before, where it's a perfect storm. So women are now mostly out in the workforce, working outside of homes, which, throughout history that's taken on different iterations. But the difference is that they are still expected to carry, in most cases, most of the time, in fact, there's some research on this, that it's still 2/3 of women are carrying the domestic load of the actual, the tasks that you have to do to run a household, caring tasks and all of those boring administrative tasks. And on top of that, there's what's called the mental load, which is the planning or the conception and the planning of those tasks, not just the execution. And sometimes those two things come apart. So it might look like the male partner or one of the other partners in the couple is doing as much physical labor in the domestic sphere, but the mental load still often falls to the female in many heterosexual couples, for example. So there's that element. And then because we're so online and the pace of our life is so fast these days, we're expected to do everything and keep up in all spheres. So not only are we juggling the work and the domestic sphere, which may or may not involve children or caring for elderly or any other caring responsibilities, but we also need to be presenting ourselves in a certain way in the world. And that's appearance, which has always been an issue for women throughout history, but also just being seen to be organized and the best at everything, having a hobby, doing extra, giving back. And it's a lot. It's too much without a support network and without the village, people throw that term around a lot, that maybe our ancestors would have had around them.
And I think you bring up an interesting conversation, which is also what are the hidden expectations placed on women? And a lot of these are unconscious, and they're beliefs that we've inherited or we've grown up with that have happened in the media, in family lineages, in communities that kind of place a certain expectation on what the caregiving roles are or what the responsibility roles are for women in the household.
Definitely. And actually, I'd go even further to say that they are deeply internalized. So, for example, in my own personal case, my husband is absolutely brilliant at the doing, but we had a conversation the other day where I said that no matter how much you're doing, I always feel that I have to check what you're doing, how you're doing it, when you're doing it, and control it. And if I'm not doing it, I feel guilty. And so there is this internalized sense of responsibility. Now, for me, and that, again, personally, that has been quite difficult to pick apart and to understand whether it's a negative thing and a pressure of I have to do this, or actually, do I want to do this? Because as a mother, for example, with my children, I wanted to be the one who got up in the night for them. I want to be the one who picks them up from school, and I want to be the one that is there. And so it's really difficult to separate that duty and that ought from that I actually want to. But I think you're right. I think they are hidden expectations and internal pressures that we put upon ourselves and that play out in all areas of our life.
And I think something you touched upon is like, it's the duality between the yearning or the desire to do it and the expectation and pressure of how perfect that outcome is.
Exactly.
And when you're taking on so much and you're running the house, you're looking after the kids, you're going to work, it's like so much pressure can be placed on you, and that's where the guilt and the perfectionism and the control tends to come in at the end of the day.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you know, you do, there's that conscientiousness of that you want to do things well and you want to people please, which is not a particularly pretty term. And again, there's two sides to that. You know, it's a lovely thing to be kind to people and to serve people, but when it crosses that line and it's at your own detriment and you are not putting on your own oxygen mask before caring for others, that's when the problems start to come in and you will reach burnout.
Yeah, and I think there is this concept now that we're starting to understand, which is burnout culture. It's like, well, where do you draw the line? Like, if you have certain expectations placed on you or you've internalized these expectations, where is that line where you say, okay, I'm beginning to burn out, and how do I peel back from that point? Because that's extremely difficult.
It's a really difficult question. And I think here we have the personal life bound up with the public life and those societal expectations. The pace of our society, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, it's running away with us. It's too fast and it's placing too much pressure on all of us. And so we don't have that time and that space to slow down and recuperate and replenish. I think we're living as far away as we possibly could from any point in history from how we're actually supposed to be as humans, as animals. We don't live in accordance with natural rhythms anymore. And okay, that's something that has existed for many, 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 many years since, you know, the Industrial Revolution and this model of living on clock time. But really, you know, our bodies have circadian rhythms, the seasons change, they should be different in different seasons. The typical office day is such a linear day, and we're living to all these rhythms that are out of sync. And so we don't have space to reconnect to ourselves. So I think there's that social pressure, but your question was like, how do you recognize when you're hitting burnout? In a world like that, I don't know how you're supposed to, because it's normalized. You know, we're desensitized to what is normal and we question, are we coping? Is it us that, you know, everyone else around us is doing it? We're supposed to be doing it. I'm not doing enough, or there's something wrong with me. But actually, if your body is, you know, screaming at you to slow down. So I think burnout comes out very physically. It is adrenal fatigue. So you will get physical symptoms. Your mind, and when you just feel that misalignment emotionally and mentally. So there's lots of signals to look out for. But I think the irony with burnout is that most of us will not catch it until we're too far gone.
Yeah, I think you touched on like several things I think that all relate to each other and they're also so impactful. And it's like, yes, the separation from ourselves and our body and the cyclical living that we're meant to be in, especially as women, because we are also running through a 30 or 40, 35-day cycle depending on the person. And that is also going to impact how we feel and how we function. And the other thing is like comparison, because we are constantly comparing. We've touched upon social media, we've touched upon looking around and seeing everyone else. So how do we identify that we ourselves are reaching burnout if everyone else seems to have it all together in this perfect ideal world, which at the end of the day is running on productivity?
Yes.
And I think that's where this conversation is going, is this hyper productivity and where we are expected to just focus on the output.
Exactly. I'm really glad that you raised that point and used that language of productivity, because we are living in a machine. And there's a debate about like what kind of world it is now, whether it's late stage capitalism, whether it's techno-fusionism. But the bottom line is that this is a production-based society, and we value what people produce, even in our relationships, you know, which it should be about the intrinsic value of that relationship and how it feels, not how it looks or not what you're producing, but we are measuring everything on outcomes and production. You know, even as a parent, we're measuring our children on how much they're producing. You know, how many clubs does your 4-year-old do? That's the product. And or I don't know, how many, you know, pretty Instagram worthy meals are you producing for your child? And we're losing the point. I think our values and our priorities have shifted, and it's just all about production. And we need to move ourselves back to actually look at, and it's extremely deep for this conversation, and obviously way outside the scope of 20 minutes chat, but what is the point of it all? Like, what does it mean to be human?
What's the point of living, I suppose, even in this sense. And it's hard not to say, but it's like, where does the point come where we can come back to what is intrinsically valuable? And like, how have we forgotten that in many ways, especially as women, where there's so much comparison, there's so much expectation, beauty culture, mom culture, production culture, work culture. It's like we forget the intrinsic value, which is our ability to be, is where our value lies.
Absolutely.
And we lose that. We've lost that in this society.
Definitely. We are human beings and not human doings. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves of that, the be rather than the do. There's too much noise and we are swept away by all of these expectations. Someone told me once, you should focus on how it feels and not how it looks. And that really stuck with me. And so now, you've got to be careful that you don't slip into being productive about not being productive, which is a catch that you can fall into.
I've fallen
everything
into it.
is a product.
Yeah, I have.
We all do, because everything is a product, everything is commercialized, everything is marketed.
Yeah.
So you've just got to carve out your own path and feel what feels right for you in those different seasons. And some people do thrive on that productivity. It's just asking yourself, what is my balance? Because that will be different for every individual and at different points.
And I think something that I've really been trying to lean on is, with this hyper productivity and the expectations and stuff that we place on ourselves, where is our being in all of it? And how can I create for the sake of what wants to be created through me versus what's the outcome of that? And that's really hard, because I always say that I'm recovering perfectionist.
Yes.
So it's like, where do I sit in this, and how do I feel in what I'm creating and letting myself create for joy and for purpose versus what the outcome is going to be? And sometimes it's challenging.
It's challenging and it's trial and error. And because we are so conditioned, socially conditioned to be constantly looking at how well we're doing something. I mainly write poetry, and I do feel that I'm writing for an audience sometimes, and I have to catch myself and I have to say, no, this is an internal exercise, and this is not about anybody else. It's not about creating a product for marketing. This is about putting yourself, in my case, on the page. Other people will express themselves in different ways, but it's just about you and meeting with yourself without any judgment from anywhere.
And I think this brings to mind a lot of it, what you mentioned before, is like how we place our value in productivity. It's like, where are we receiving love or validation or attention through our productivity? And sometimes when there is a void in what we value about ourselves and we don't quite see that, we can fall into the trap of having our productivity be something that we receive validation and love through. And that is quite challenging.
Absolutely. And I think we're now entering into a very vicious cycle, because we're living in obviously this world where everybody is on this productivity treadmill. And so our children are going to inherit that, which means that there's going to be a void there, and they are going to feel that they are measured by their production and their output, when actually, we should be nurturing other parts of them and loving, without conditions, without production, just for who they are. So it's a really tough one, because I think that you're right. I think that sometimes we are producing because we don't feel good enough. And where does that good enoughness come from? It comes from unconditional love, whether that's from your parents or from yourself or from another source in your life. And that can be a thing as well as a person. Creativity, it's a two-way relationship. The art loves you unconditionally and you love it unconditionally back.
So I think it's like, a lot of the time, whatever we have internalized in our life experience, the unconscious patterns, the unconscious beliefs, the stories, that is inherently how we're going to parent our kids, because it can be, a lot of it is like the unconscious patterns that we pass on. So if we are valuing productivity, if we're valuing validation outside of us unconsciously, we are passing that on, not only through our DNA and through our own womb spaces as women or womb holders, but also through the way that we parent.
Absolutely. No, definitely. And actually now we know that these things comes through the ancestral chain, and epigenetics have shown that, your life experiences or your traumas, they shape your genes. And so they are very really passed on. It's really hard. And it's something that as a parent, I find a lot of guilt, because I feel like, my obsession with perfectionism or productivity. And my children see me doing that, and I'm modeling it in a certain way. I try really hard not to. And then also, you know, that disposition to be like a slightly type A personality, I suppose. It's really, really hard. So we have to do internal work. You have to do the inner work, and you have to, I'm going to use the big word, heal, and work on that and shift, you know, reshape your neural pathways. And one of the beautiful things is that we do have that neuroplasticity. And actually, neuroscience has shown us that there are 3 stages in our life when our brains are most plastic. 0 to 3, adolescence, and then in a period that's called matrescence or putrescence, when you become a parent and your brain chemistry is changing again, the neural pathways are more malleable. And so it's a perfect time when you do have children, and especially when your children are young, it's also the hardest time, but to start doing that work and looking at yourself and looking at your values and looking at what your traumas are, what your triggers are, what your dispositions are, and to start doing that work. And both you and your child will benefit from that. And then looking outwards from the micro to the macro, if we're all doing a little bit on ourselves and then passing it on to our children in our future generations, then that trickles into our societies on a smaller level than up to a bigger level.
And I think like this is such an important conversation, because even a practice that I was doing this week is just, what are my stories around this life situation? And even reflecting on all the stories that we tell ourselves daily, they pin back to what our belief systems are. Absolutely. And that is such a simple and effective way of how can I look deeper into this and take responsibility for how I am unconsciously projecting this out into the world or into my life. And it's a way that we can really, with humility and compassion, say, okay, what am I bringing to my life right now? And in a most loving way, so that we can begin to shape and model how we do see it, because we do have this neuroplasticity. We can rethink and we can release old stories and old beliefs just by bringing awareness to them. And I think anytime we bring awareness to something, that inherently is bringing a shift to it.
Yes. The awareness is half the battle. And in fact, it can be very frustrating, because once you've taken that leap of the awareness and you identify what your patterns are, it's very frustrating because you then want to solve them. The solving is more difficult and it's persistence over time, but the awareness is half the battle, and you have to give yourself that compassion and that grace when you recognize that.
For me, like, I always think it's like awareness inherently is going to create a shift, because it's creating an openness of mind to see things differently, for solutions to come in without having to, you know, like the overfixer. Like if I see something in me that, you know, we want to be on the, just as production, we also want to be focused on solutions. But sometimes we don't need solutions. Sometimes we just need presence with what it is.
Exactly, it's presence. And again, you know, in this over-commercialized world, people will try to sell you a pill, a machine, or whatever the latest, you know, trend is. There are solutions for everything, but that's not necessarily what we need. And every individual, and you know, I'm sorry that we can't give a magic bullet here, but every individual will have different answers. But I think that mostly it comes down to refinding that connection with yourself,
with who we are,
with your community, with your close community, with your wider community. Nature is very, very important. You know, we live, again, to say so far away from what humans are, but we are part of nature. And I'm sorry to get whimsical here, but you know, when you go and walk out in the countryside and you feel you are reconnecting to yourself. It's very cleansing and it's very healing. And I think, you know, that's a good way to start. For some people, it's water, and it's just start opening that dialogue with yourself.
Yeah, and I think for me, the two things that you've mentioned, water and nature, the two things that connect me instantly. But more than anything, in those things, it is the silence and the disconnection from a super busy world and a super busy mind. Because if we do not have stillness or we do not have silence in our mind, it's very, very hard to see what's underneath.
Absolutely.
Which is the subconscious.
Absolutely. It's taking a pause, taking a step back and finding perspective. And in today's world, and I know throughout history, there have always been issues. So I'm always careful when I describe the world today as an atrocity. But it's very easy to feel like the world is ending, like everything is awful and to, you know, it's all catastrophic. But if you take a step back and you keep that perspective and you focus on what are your values, what are your priorities, and you take that pause, slow down, everything will feel better, even if it's just for a heartbeat. But that's what we need, those little micro pockets, because the reality is we live within the structures we live in. You know, you can't leave your job and the pace of that hamster wheel of your job tomorrow, because there are bills to pay and the cost of living because of the world we live in, and you know, everything is interbound, and the structures we live in, they don't support that. So you have to step outside them, even if it's just for that heartbeat.
Yeah, and it brings this whole concept of like choosing that, right? Prioritizing that. And sometimes when we are in that hamster wheel, it's fine to like hard to grip onto that like as a priority, but it's like what is something that you value, that you feel in this moment is going to be serving you, and how can we just choose that today in this moment and start from there?
Yeah, it is really hard. Like I always say, I'm awful at meditation, and I think you have to find things that if there's a resistance, it's maybe not the right modality or path for you, within reason. If everything is resistant because you just can't be bothered, then that's something very different. But if there's a lot of resistance there, then it's probably not the right modality or path. But I always say to myself as well that I most need that quiet space when my mind or my life is at its loudest and most chaotic, and yet that is when I feel there's less time and space for that quiet space. So when you feel that you can't, that's when you most need it.
That's a resistance coming up, to like interfere. And I think what you mentioned really about the creativity, I think that's a beautiful topic to go into it just a little bit before we finish, because for me, creativity is also this place where I can be in joy and in pleasure and in just like a flow state, like almost a form of meditation for many people who can't find that stillness.
Yes.
So what do you recommend for someone to find their little creative outlet in the world?
It's really hard because, again, as I've said, everybody is an individual, and creativity is a very, very, very broad term. It doesn't have to be, writing or painting or music. Some people can be creative through anything that's using their hands, or through sports, or through even just in the way that they're interacting with their community and, their problem solving. So it's finding where you feel that there's not that resistance, and where you can easily access that flow state. So when time dissipates, it disappears, and you feel like you're just on another plane and the chatter of your mind is quiet. That's what it is for you. And for everyone, it will be something different. So it might be experimentation. It's probably not sitting and watching Netflix. Which some of us feel because we're so exhausted that that's like, we feel that's rest, but you will know the flow state when you enter it. So it's about finding what works for you and what feels right.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.